Later this week, all eyes will be on Alaska, the backdrop for this high-stakes meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin of Russia. There might be a reset of relations, but tensions in Europe are running high. The summit's already being described, of course, as a diplomatic gamble. What will it mean for peace in Ukraine? Later on today, European leaders will be holding a joint phone call to try to coordinate their response and, presumably, try to pressure President Trump into towing the line, as it were. To help us look ahead as to what's at stake and how this thing might go, we are joined on the Whitehall Sources podcast by Professor Sam Greene, Professor of Russian Politics at King's College London. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Good to see you. Where did this summit come from? How have we got to the point where Trump and Putin are going to sit down in Alaska and potentially work towards peace in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, how much time have you got, Colin? I mean, the proximate cause, right, of this summit is not a breakthrough, right? Usually, if you were going to have people meeting at this level, it would be because there had been lots of diplomatic work done in the background. The senior professional diplomats would have worked under the leadership of their principals, right, to reach some sort of a moment in which it would make sense to wheel out the heads of state. I suppose every once in a while you might want to use the heads of state or the heads of government to engineer a breakthrough, right? If the formal diplomacy is deadlocked, but neither of those things is what's happened in this situation, right? Trump set a deadline. He then moved up that deadline. That deadline was last Friday, right? For Putin to end the war or face some kind of consequence. The consequence most likely was going to be a significant ramp up of U.S. sanctions, and I think that created a problem for both of them, right? There was no way in which Putin was ever going to be seen to make a deal under that kind of pressure from the White House, right? So actually stopping the fighting as a result of that ultimatum was never on the cards. But by the same token, he couldn't afford to let Trump pick up his ball and go home, because Trump is too important an interlocutor and too important a source of leverage over the Ukrainians and the Europeans. So he was in a bit of a bind, and Trump was in a bit of a bind. He needed his ultimatum to look like it was going to achieve something, but he also didn't want to have to rely on sanctions, which he himself recognized might not achieve anything. And so there was sort of a double chance of looking weak and ineffectual. I think they both needed an off-ramp, and some kind of a meeting seemed like that opportunity, right? It was a way for Putin to signal some goodwill without giving anything up, and a way for Trump to say, well, look, all of my threats did actually get Putin to the table. We're now making progress, and so we can all forget about those sanctions that I never really wanted to do in the first place.
And so, what should we be hoping for? Should we be hoping for anything from this meeting? Is there already, and what I mean, with that in mind, has Putin already won? The fact this meeting is happening, it's happening in America, it's happening in Alaska, which used to belong to Russia years and years ago. Is it a win for Putin already?
Well, there are certainly some wins in the fact that it is happening, right, for Putin. I mean, first of all, it really flips the script, right? Ever since the NATO summit in The Hague, we had, a month and a half of consistent rhetoric from Trump about his frustration with Putin. A month and a half of consistent rhetoric from Trump on anything is meaningful, right? And I think that was a problem for Putin. That's now done and dusted from his perspective. The fact that it's happening in the U.S., as you said, right? I mean, the U.S. is not a party to the Rome Statute, so it's not obligated legally to arrest him on that International Criminal Court warrant. But at the same time, the Biden administration did support that warrant, right? And did say that Putin should be arrested. Now, of course, you're not going to arrest your negotiating partner, but you also have to welcome him into your home, right? So that flips the script on that as well. And then structurally, the fact that neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans broadly, and the UK included, are at the table in Anchorage is exactly the way that Putin wants things to be. Now, that's a series of situational wins, right? That does not necessarily translate into a strategic victory for Putin. The strategic victory for Putin would emerge if he is able to convince Trump, not only in the reasonableness of whatever offer Putin puts on the table, if he does put something on the table, but to then actually become a source of leverage in Kyiv and in European capitals to actually get that deal over the line.
The danger for Putin. I mean, as much as anybody can read the mind of Donald Trump, I suspect that some of this is, frankly, Donald Trump wanting to, after months and months of sort of increasing frustration and kind of growing rhetoric against Putin, I think he wants to look the guy in the whites of his eyes, basically, and size him up and work out whether he is, a kind of legitimate player or playing for time, as presumably a lot of Donald Trump's advisors are saying. So that I suppose the danger for Putin is that if he overplays his hand, if he comes with a set of unreasonable demands, and it's clear that he isn't really interested in pursuing peace, and more than that, actually makes Trump feel played or condescended to, is that a very real danger that actually he will walk away from it and harden some of that rhetoric we've seen from Trump, and he will go for secondary sanctions regardless of whether they work or not?
Yeah, I think that danger is there, right? I don't look. Let me be honest. I've spent a large part of my life trying to get inside, or actually trying to avoid getting inside Putin's head. I'm now being asked a lot to get inside Trump's head, and that's not a more comfortable place, and I'm not any more capable of it. So we've never really understood what the bedrock of that relationship is between Trump and Putin. Clearly, it's something that Trump takes seriously. Whether or not that has genuinely shifted over the last month and a half or so with this frustration, we don't know. Right? Maybe it has. Maybe there is an opportunity for a real breakdown in that relationship. In which case, Putin ought to be careful. But I think the reality is that Putin's not going to be any better at reading Trump than we are, certainly than I am. Right? Yes, they've met, but he's also been burned in the past by Trump, as has everybody who's ever tried to do a deal with Trump. So he's not unique in that respect. But he, I think, will feel the need to be careful, and he will probably try to be reasonably careful. Although he also won't want to look overly pliant and manipulable, right? Because he also understands that Trump, when he senses an opening, right, will take that opening and try to run with it, right? So there is that danger, and I think, frankly, that has always been, right, since the start of this second Trump administration, the overwhelming likelihood, right, that these are two men who always need to be winning, coming up with a solution that ends the war in Ukraine, right, requires both of them to lose something, or at least requires one of them to lose something, right, depending on how it ends up being structured. And that's just not available. Right? Now, it might be doable if Trump were consistent in his application of pressure to Putin, but he's not. And he hasn't shown any indication that he wants to be, right? In fact, he's shown every indication that what he really wants to do is find a way to end this war, almost however that can be done, right? With very few structural limitations on what that might look like, in order to get back to some kind of a transactional, flexible relationship with Russia. And that seems to be his consistent overriding goal.
And one of the difficulties, I think, for Trump is his motivation here is kind of twofold. One, obviously, I think he genuinely wants a peace prize. I think it really grinds his gears that Obama's got one and he hasn't, even though he's solved 5 wars already. And this one remains on the table. But he has this almost endearing view of why can't we all just make trade and not war. It's not an unreasonable and in many ways an admirable position. But Putin's not, if Putin was worried about, the consequences on the economy, he might be looking for an off-ramp too now. He's clearly not. This isn't about kind of trade or, the impact on his people or, is this really all about legacy for Putin? Is this his greatest motivating factor?
Well, there's a lot of things going on from Putin's point of view. Let me unpack, because there's a lot of things going on in that question as well. I mean,
Sorry.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, it's kind of a nice encapsulation of the reality, right? Because everybody is sort of playing on these multiple planes at the same time, right? So let's say, what you're interested in is, and yes, there is something admirable to the idea that, wouldn't it be nice if we could just all get along and trade and do business? Of course, Trump's idea of doing business is slightly different from, most American administrations, and his idea of trade is slightly different from most American administrations, right? So he's clearly weaponized trade. And if you are Putin, actually, you're kind of pretty happy at the moment. You're one of the few countries that doesn't have a tight tariff regime. But if you are thinking that you could get to the point where you just have free trade with the United States, right? You're probably fooling yourself. And I don't think more broadly, though, that is actually what Putin is interested in, right? So to come back to why this war and the outcome of this war matters. I mean, there are certainly ideological and yes, legacy-oriented sort of ideas in Putin's mind. I think he genuinely does believe in the idea of Russia as an empire, and in Russia's not only right, but in fact sort of inherent duty to dominate the entirety of the land that it once ruled, or at least the vast majority of it, right? And I really do think that is what this war in large measure is about. But this war is also doing other things, right? So this war has totally restructured the balance of economic power in Russia. Right? It's taken a class of people who benefited from trade and from financial flows and from being part of a globalized economy and a progressive economy. And a lot of them are still there, but they're much further down the food chain than they used to be. It's taken people in the security sector and people who've become war profiteers and put them right up at the top of that food chain. It's also the only thing at the moment that's actually driving economic growth, right? So every other sector in the economy that's not linked to the war is in secular decline, and will remain in secular decline unless Russia gets to the point where it can reintegrate with the entirety of the global economy, right? Come back to that. I think that's unlikely, right? But also, it is the cornerstone of Putin's political regime at this point. It excuses and explains and justifies all of the repression and the political control that he has, right? His control, increasingly draconian control over the media, over public spaces, over really anything that somebody says, in their private lives or in social media is potentially punishable. I don't want to exaggerate. People aren't always being surveilled, but there's always that sense of vulnerability, and impacts people's lives. And Putin will be very wary about letting either of those things go, right? He won't want to see the end of the war lead to another redistribution in the Russian economy, which could be destabilizing, or to a relaxation of the need for political control, which would also be destabilizing. So one way or another, right, even if the fighting stops, geopolitical confrontation with the West, and especially with Europe, needs to remain. It's too important to Putin. But also, and this is again where the trade comes back in, Putin has, over the years, come to the conclusion that the world system, right, dominated by the institutions of, frankly, the Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions of international trade and finance, right, work much better for the West than they do for Russia. And in fact can become important sources of leverage and power for Western countries. They are what makes sanctions work at the end of the day. That central role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency makes sanctions powerful amongst other things, and the globalization of trade makes sanctions powerful. So he wants to insulate himself and Russia from those structures. And so I think that even if somebody were to offer him the opportunity to fully reintegrate Russia in global trade and financial flows, I don't think he would want to do it.
And worryingly, actually, that pushes him increasingly towards looking at China and Iran and creating a sort of new, bolster economy in a kind of authoritarian states against the West. I mean, that should be a worry for all of us.
It does, and it is, right? And those who've been working on sanctions policy in London and in Washington and Brussels and other places have been afraid of what happens, right? If you actually end up splitting the global economy into two functionally separate economic systems, right? And we already see that the Russians with their allies are developing new mechanisms of trade, new mechanisms of finance that go around the dollar and the euro and the pound, as well as new insurance systems and things, right? To sort of insulate the shadow fleet from sanctions and other sorts of pressure and control, right? What Putin, I think, is trying to do. Right, he doesn't have any difficulty convincing the Iranians and the North Koreans that this is a good idea. It's a little bit harder to convince the Chinese that this is a good idea because the Chinese, while skeptical, I think, of Western power and very much wanting to have a more powerful seat at that top table, have also benefited tremendously from this globalized system of trade and finance, right? So they're not inherently interested in seeing it break down.
Can I ask as well, Sam, what more we can make of Europe's role in this at this point? And I'm thinking of the flurry of activity around the coalition of the willing a few months ago, when there was sort of great enthusiasm for showing support for Zelensky and this is how this is going to work and we're on your side. Fine. There's a call today, which will be European leaders for an hour, and then President Trump and I think Vice President Vance will join for an hour thereafter. Are European leaders adapting well to the unconventional nature of Trump's approach?
No.
And what does that mean? That's a real issue. That is a significant problem.
I mean, so it's been interesting to observe, right? Is one way of putting it, right? Europe was aghast at the first Trump administration, but found a way to work with it. And the first Trump administration was in a lot of ways much more institutionalized and predictable than this one has turned out to be. But it was predictable that this one was going to be different. And so after the election, you began to see people in Europe, and I include the UK in this one way or another, right, to you began to see people, mobilizing in the service of what we now, again, I think, get to call European strategic autonomy. Right? Something we tried not to talk about for a long time, and is now very much back on the agenda, right? Because there was this emergent, not just danger, but likelihood, right, that Europe would find itself squeezed between at least a situational alliance of Washington and Moscow. Given everything that we were hearing from Trump before the election, during the election, and after the election, right, that seemed to be the direction of motion. And so that's why you began, again, even before the inauguration, right, to see this conversation between Macron and Starmer and first Scholz and then Merz and with Poles involved, about some kind of a reassurance force, right, about increases in defense, industrial investment and defensive capacity across Europe, and a more institutionalized commitment to Ukrainian security. That picked up speed, obviously, after the Trump administration came into power, particularly after that fiasco in the Oval Office with Zelensky, when it became, palpable, right? Just how much I think European leaders began to understand that they would need not just to have their own way of dealing with things, but they would have to potentially confront the Trump administration and confront Washington. And that's, from a resource position and frankly an emotional and a political position, a very difficult place to imagine yourself, right? That's not the way that we've done business in the last 80 years, right? So it is not hard to see why this has been a very long and a very difficult conversation. But it is striking that, here we are now, 6-7 months down the road. We're at a position that feels very much like we were in, February of 2025, when there is this very real prospect of a Moscow-Washington condominium at the expense of Europe, and I also include Ukraine in that Europe equation. And the infrastructure for doing something about it doesn't feel to me any more developed than it was in February, right? So we're still having these conversations, right? In fact, there's probably less of a sense of what a reassurance force would look like than there was in February, right? At that point, we were actually talking about numbers of troops, right? And now we're not talking about any troops and maybe some planes in the sky, but, still have to figure out, what the U.S. contribution would need to be, and the U.S. is being very coy about that. Except when it's actually saying there will be no U.S. contribution. And so instead of trying to create its own table, right, to sit down with the Ukrainians and figure out how do we create security on the European continent in a way that insulates Europe from threats, both from Moscow and from Washington. The approach has continually been just to try to wedge Europe into that Washington-Moscow table one way or another, and that's what this call today is another instance of.
And this is the tale of Europe throughout the last 3 years, isn't it? I mean, they've always given Ukraine, enough military support not to lose the war, but not enough to win it. And even when there was a need at the back end of last year to Trump-proof Ukraine's position, they still dragged their feet in long-range weapons, etc., and sanctioning the use of those. And as far as I can see, the only thing that we've achieved with the Coalition of the Willing is the name, the Coalition of the Willing. You're right. If anything, it's gone backwards. But I hear time and time again from sort of military experts that, there's every likelihood that within the next 5 to 10 years, Europe will be in a war with Russia. Do you think that is likely? And do you think Europe has fully got to grips with the scale of the threat that is on its borders?
Okay, so is a war with Russia likely? It is more likely than it has ever been in living memory and probably going beyond that. There have been wars with Russia before, obviously, depending on where you situate yourself in sort of European history. But certainly since the Cold War, right, I think we are at the most dangerous point. And given that, as we've discussed, we have a Russian regime that is wedded to geopolitical confrontation with Europe, that sees wars as a legitimate and in some ways profitable tool of foreign policy making, right? That sees borders as movable and sees hard power and military power as a substitute for the soft power that Russia lacks. Yes, I mean, war is a very real possibility. Would it be incredibly foolhardy for Russia to invade any NATO member state? And that's pretty much all they've got left, right, on the continent at this point. Yes, of course, but it was incredibly foolhardy to invade Ukraine, right? So that does not give me confidence that Russia won't do it. What would give me confidence that Russia might want to do it would be consistent European investment in its deterrent capacity. And to give Europe credit, right, we are seeing Europe move much more consistently in that direction than we really have at any point in, again, living memory, right? Yes, Europe's been slow. Right? Yes, until very recently, the U.S. obviously was outstripping Europe on military expenditure for Ukraine. But I mean, I do want to give Europe some credit here, right? So once the U.S. under the Trump administration stopped spending on arms for Ukraine, Europe has closed the gap entirely, right? So every dollar or euro that the U.S. has not spent has been picked up by Europe. Now, that's not entirely like for like, right? There are things that the Europeans simply don't make and can't provide, right? So, Patriot missiles, for example, some of these interceptor systems simply aren't there. There are other sources of support, some of the intelligence support. Also, because there's always been a division of labor in NATO. There's some things that the U.S. does, there's some things that the Europeans do, and if you withdraw the U.S. leg from that, then Europe's going to limp, right, for some period of time until it can rebuild its own capacity. But we also see, for the first time, a defense portfolio in the European Commission. Right? We have Kubilius as commissioner for defense and defense industrial production. We have seen consistently increasing investment and consistently creative approaches to financing that investment that really leverages the power that the European Commission have and that member states have. We have governments, for the time being, in France, as well as consistently now in in Germany, in the Nordics as well, right, and even in Italy, right, that are committed to this agenda of strengthening Europe's defensive capacity, right. So I think we're seeing movement in that direction, right? Is it fast enough? Potentially not, right? Are we going to have endless debates about what really counts as defense spending? Certainly, including here in the UK. Right? But is there movement in that direction? Right? And is that frankly being created in part by the anxieties emanating from Washington? Yeah, there is.
Professor Sam Greene, thank you very much. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your expertise. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.